I showed up unexpectedly at the company's special party and saw a strange man kiss my wife, and in that instant, I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. There was no scream, just a silence that said it all. I left without saying goodbye, ending a story she had already betrayed. I didn't expect you to come, she said later, but it was too late. Time passed, and while she discovered her lover didn't want a commitment, I found peace with a new love, one who knows the value of loyalty. Alone, she tried to get back together, overcome with regret. I listened, looked into her eyes, and offered what I still had left, forgiveness. Not to return, but so that each of us could move forward in peace, albeit on different paths. I never imagined pain could manifest itself so silently. There was no scream, no scene, no fight, just a dense, piercing silence that invaded me, as if time itself had frozen around me. It wasn't a cinematic shot, there was no dramatic lighting, no soundtrack, but I swear that, in that instant, everything fell silent. The voices, the laughter, the glasses clinking in the background, everything disappeared. There were only the two of them there. She, with that smile I thought was uniquely mine. He, with his hand resting on her waist, as if he knew every curve, every nuance of that body that had been sleeping beside me for years. My body froze. A kind of cold that doesn't come from outside, but from within. A collapse of the inner world. I tried to blink, to breathe, to do something that would pull me back to reality. But it was already reality. This was really happening. It wasn't a misunderstanding, nor a misinterpretation. They kissed like they shouldn't, and she let him do it like she had let him do it before. I didn't make a fuss. I didn't go to her. I didn't ask her anything. I just turned my back, my heart in pieces, and walked away. Not out of pride. But because, in that second, I realized something had broken irreversibly. Sometimes, the end of a story isn't announced with screams or tears, it happens the exact moment you realize you're no longer needed. When love dies in silence. And I left. Without goodbyes, without a word. Because any words in that moment would have been too small to contain what I was feeling. She tried to reach me in the following days. She sent messages, made excuses, asked if I was okay. And finally, she uttered the phrase that marked our last conversation, "I didn't expect you to come." As if my presence there had been the mistake. As if the fact that I saw what I saw was the problem, and not what she was doing when she thought I wouldn't show up. I'd reread that sentence so many times that I knew its rhythm, every comma, every hidden intention. I didn't expect you to come. Not because she wanted to protect me from pain, but because she was planning a night without consequences. She just hadn't calculated the unexpected. The days turned into weeks. The weeks into months. And I sank into silence. Not the bitter, resentful silence, but the one that precedes rebirth. I gradually picked up the pieces of myself. I began to breathe again. Discovering, with pain and surprise, that it is possible to survive something like this. I discovered that even when trust is broken in the cruelest way, there remains something within us that pulses. Something that doesn't die. A kind of dignity that rises from the mud, however stained, however hesitant. And it was in this place of weariness and lucidity that I found a new love. Not a replacement, not an escape, but someone who arrived slowly, carefully, as if understanding the value of silence and time. Someone who listened to my pain without rushing to heal it, who didn't try to occupy spaces that weren't yet ready, but who taught me, day after day, that loyalty still exists. And that love is only true when it doesn't need to hide anything. Meanwhile, she sank into her own emptiness. The lover who seemed to be the new chapter in her life vanished as if he'd never existed. She didn't want commitment, she didn't want routine, she didn't want the real weight of love. It was just a fleeting breath, a fire that burns quickly and consumes everything around it. And when the ashes settled, she realized she was alone. She tried to return. She searched for the right words, but none made sense. She tried to reach out with memories, with apologies, with regret. And there I was, firm, calm, but transformed. I was no longer the same. Something inside me had matured brutally. I still loved her, on some level, perhaps I always had, but it was a different love. A love that no longer demanded presence. That no longer demanded return. It was a love that ached peacefully. She cried. She asked me for a chance. She said she now knew what she'd lost. And I believed her. Because she was telling the truth. But it wasn't about believing anymore. It was about understanding that some choices have definitive consequences. And that sometimes, life doesn't offer a second chance. I looked into her eyes and offered what I still had left, forgiveness. Not the kind of forgiveness that invites you back, but the kind that frees you. The forgiveness that doesn't return to the past, but honors what we were. And with that gesture, I closed the door she herself had left wide open on the day of her betrayal. And time, always time, followed its course. I carried with me the scars, but also the peace of someone who no longer carried unnecessary weight. She, in turn, tried to rebuild. But nothing seemed the same color. The songs, the places, the smells, everything brought back what was lost. What she had given into the hands of someone who only wanted to play. And the worst punishment wasn't my absence. It was seeing me happy with someone else. It was realizing that the smile that was once hers alone now belonged to another woman. And not because she was replaced, but because she replaced herself. Because she traded what was right for curiosity. Stability for fleeting emotion. And she discovered, the hard way, that those who trade loyalty for desire don't gain love, they gain emptiness. She saw me once, months later, in a random coffee shop. I was with my new partner. We were laughing. A light, natural laugh. A laugh that didn't try to hide anything, that wasn't heavy, that wasn't fake. When our eyes met, she froze. And in that exact moment, I knew, that was where it all ended. Not at the party. Not in the betrayal. But in that look, she understood there was no turning back. She realized her place in me no longer existed. And that, for the first time, she was the one on the outside. I could have gone to her. I could have been cruel. I could have used that scene as revenge. But no. I just held the hand of whoever was with me and kept smiling. Because sometimes, the greatest response one can give is to move on with dignity. And that day, perhaps for the first time, she understood what she truly lost. It wasn't just a husband. It was a love that knew her completely. That knew her traumas, her pain, her quirks. That was by her side when no one else wanted to be. That believed when she didn't even believe in herself. That fought for both of us when only one was trying. And that kind of love, once it's gone, doesn't come back. But what no one knows is that night at the party, before I left in silence, I left something behind. Something she only discovered much later. And it was this discovery that changed everything. Welcome to the channel. Here, we don't romanticize betrayal. On the contrary, each story told is fiction with a real purpose, to show how betrayal destroys lives, corrodes feelings, and leaves scars that not even time can erase. The stories are made up, but the emotions are true, and the lesson is always clear: whoever cheats loses much more than they imagine. Get ready now to hear a story strong, deep and shocking. A story that will move you. Marcos and Helena met on an ordinary night, one of those when nothing seems about to happen, but fate, silently, already prepares its threads to intertwine lives. It was at a dinner with mutual friends, a small group, unpretentious conversation, shy laughter, and glances that, at first glance, said nothing, but that later would say everything. Marcos was reserved, calm-spoken, direct-eyed, always attentive to the subtext of what others were saying. Helena, on the other hand, was pure light and movement, the kind of person who attracts attention without asking for it, who walks into a room and changes the temperature without realizing it. They didn't fall in love instantly. What happened there was mutual curiosity, a slight, pleasant discomfort, as if they both sensed there was something to be discovered, and, therefore, there was no rush. In the days that followed, they began meeting by chance. Or perhaps by unconscious choice. In cafes, at events, in the same circles. They began talking more often, looking into each other's eyes when they weren't around. Until one day, without fanfare, they decided to have dinner together. Just the two of them. And it was there, without any grand declaration, that they realized something had changed. There was no proposal, no solemn promises, but the feeling grew as things that last do, silent, deep, almost imperceptible. Marcos said their love was like a house built little by little, brick by brick. Helena liked the idea that they were like a garden, something that needed to be watered, tended, respected in its own time. They came from different worlds, but complemented each other in their absences. Marcos had grown up in a more restrained environment, where feelings were always measured, while Helena was overly expressive, almost as if she needed to show everything she felt to avoid suffocating. And yet, they found balance. He calmed her. She pushed him out of his shell. In the early years, they built a relaxed routine, albeit one full of commitments. She worked in communications and events, always surrounded by people, flashes of light, tight deadlines, and adrenaline. He, a systems engineer, lived in a world of numbers, logic, calculations, and predictions. Their differences didn't drive them apart. Quite the opposite. It seemed they were at two extremes, attracted to each other with an almost magnetic force. When they arrived home, each brought with them stories from different worlds, which made each conversation a new encounter. They bought a small apartment downtown, decorated it together, argued over wall colors and sofa styles, but in the end, everything always seemed to end in laughter. They developed habits of their own, Sunday mornings with strong coffee and cheese bread, bad Friday night movies, her habit of making lists for everything, and his of losing his house keys almost every week. The imperfections became part of their routine and, over time, almost sweet. They were far from an ideal couple, but they had something rare, a shared admiration. Marcos admired the way Helena could transform chaotic situations into organized environments with her gentle leadership. Helena melted every time he fell silent before answering a difficult question, as if weighing each word to avoid hurting feelings. They said they complemented each other because they were different, but deep down, what truly united them was respect. Their gaze held more than love, it held recognition. Time passed, and life, with its own rhythms, became more demanding. Both grew in their careers. Helena began to gain visibility within her company, taking on larger roles, participating in important meetings, and being invited to travel, events, and corporate dinners. She flourished in social settings. Marcos, even more introverted, remained steadfast in his technical field, working on large projects, but increasingly absorbed in his own world. They still loved each other, still shared the same roof, but their time together was swallowed up by commitments, schedules, meetings, and an invisible weariness that goes unnamed but is felt between the lines. The routine, once comfortable, began to strain. The silences grew. Not out of anger or indifference, but out of exhaustion. Sometimes, they would look at each other and know they wanted to talk, but lacked the strength to begin. Helena still smiled as she talked about her accomplishments at work, but Marcos's eyes began to wander over the technical details of his day. He no longer commented as much on what he did, and she, without realizing it, began to disconnect from those parts of him. Conversations that were once full of excitement became objective summaries of the day. Time for the two of them, once sacred, became a negotiable affair. I have a meeting today that runs late. I'm leaving early tomorrow. I have a company dinner on Saturday. Simple things, but they accumulate like dust in corners, and before you know it, it's everywhere. Even so, there was still affection. There were still lingering kisses when one of them was traveling. There were still messages with silly emojis during the day. There was still desire, though more spaced out. They slept cuddled up some nights. On others, they simply fell exhausted onto the mattress. No one mentioned a crisis. Not because there wasn't something out of place, but because there was still enough love to sweep it all under the rug. It wasn't arguments that hurt. It was the silence. The boredom. The absence of the gaze that seeks the other with intention. The loss of the small gestures that fuel affection. It wasn't a breakup, it was a slow, almost imperceptible distancing, like someone who slowly falls asleep on a couch, and only realizes they've slept when they wake up, unsure of how much time has passed. Helena started going to more events without Marcos. At first, she invited him, insisted. He politely declined, with tiredness in his voice and an apologetic look in his eyes. Then she stopped insisting. He began encouraging her to go alone, to enjoy herself. He believed that giving freedom was also a form of love. He trusted her. He knew who she was. The problem is that sometimes people change. And sometimes, those who trust so much that they don't realize when they're starting to be left behind. Helena enjoyed the admiration she received at these events. She liked feeling heard, valued, praised. It was something that didn't happen as often at home anymore. Not because Marcos had stopped loving her, but because his way of showing love was discreet, almost invisible. And the invisible, when not felt, seems absent. And the absent, when accumulated, makes room for the desire to be noticed elsewhere. None of this was discussed. Not out of fear, but out of complacency. They both believed they were just going through a phase. That all it took was time and everything would fall into place. That this wasn't the end, just a pause, a weariness. The problem was that while they waited for this time, something inside them was already beginning to change. No guilt, no anger, no hurt, just change. Marcos began spending more time in silence. Helena, more time away from home. The apartment, once full of life, became nothing more than a meeting place between the comings and goings of routine. Sunday coffee was no longer sacred. Friday night movies became rare. There was still love, but it was lost in a maze of distractions. And it was in this context of emotional silence and disguised absence of routine that everything began to fall apart. Without either of them realizing it right away. And perhaps that was the mistake, believing that love, because it's strong, survives on its own. But love, even the truest, requires presence. It requires care. It requires choice. And when those choices are no longer made day after day, what remains isn't a lack of love, it's a lack of priority. They still smiled at each other some mornings. They still said good night with a light kiss. They still slept in the same bed. But they no longer dreamed the same things. They no longer walked in the same direction. And so it was, amidst this silent abyss, that an impulsive decision, a seemingly small gesture, would change everything. But none of them knew it yet. They were still in the storm's blind spot, that moment when the sky seems calm, but the winds are already beginning to blow within. Marcos began to notice the signs, but he couldn't quite grasp their meaning. They were small details, gestures that began to happen less frequently, automatic responses, touches too quick, silences too long. Helena became increasingly distant, like a station slowly disappearing through a train window, without realizing exactly when it was left behind. She said she was simply tired, exhausted by the demands of work, and he believed her. Not because he was naive, but because he trusted her. He took her at her word, as he always had, as if sincerity were a natural extension of love. There were days when she barely looked him in the eye when she spoke. Others when she arrived late, claiming meetings had gone on too long. Marcos didn't argue. He'd never liked confrontation and preferred to believe it was all temporary, that Helena would return to her old self, that this phase, however strange, would eventually pass. On the few nights they spent together, the silence between them was filled with attempts at normalcy. Marcos asked questions about her day, but the answers came ready-made, mechanical, as if rehearsed. Helena smiled so that her eyes didn't touch. She was still there, in the same physical space, but she no longer seemed present. It was as if she had learned to inhabit the house without leaving a trace, passing through him like a vague memory. Even so, he tried. He tried to rekindle something between them, prepared simple dinners, suggested weekend outings, but there was always something more urgent, more important, something that pushed her away and justified his absence. And, little by little, Marcos also began to fall silent, not out of giving up, but out of fear of discovering it was already too late. The atmosphere between them grew cold in a way that hurt more than any argument. It was the lack that hurt, the absence disguised as routine. Helena became an edited version of herself. More reserved, more careful with her cell phone, more cautious with her schedule. Marcos, although he felt all of this, insisted on rationalizing. He preferred to think it was just stress, that she needed time, space. The idea of distrust seemed incompatible with the love they had built, with everything they had experienced. They still slept in the same bed, but now there was a space between their bodies, a gap that seemed to grow with each night. Kisses before bed became hurried touches on the cheeks, and deeper conversations gave way to monosyllables. Still, he kept trying to hold on to what was left. He believed that love, when true, is patient. That weathering storms was part of the journey. But what he didn't know was that the storm had already passed, and left ruins in its wake. One night, while Helena was taking a shower, her phone vibrated incessantly on the table. It wasn't curiosity that moved Marcos, but an involuntary, almost physical discomfort. He wasn't the type of man to mess with her, he always respected her space and boundaries, but at that moment, something inside him screamed. He picked up the phone and saw a message notification with a name he didn't recognize. He opened the preview, and before I could even read it, his heart was racing. These weren't words you'd say to a coworker. They were intimate, charged with a desire you don't feel for someone ordinary. Helena got out of the shower soon after, found the phone in his hands, and for the first time in a long time, there was truth in her eyes, but it was a painful truth that didn't need explaining. She didn't deny it. She didn't cry either. She simply remained silent, as if she'd been waiting for that moment for a long time. Marcos said nothing at that moment. He simply left his cell phone on the table and left the room, as if understanding that, from then on, any words would be insufficient. The following days were marked by a strange attempt to maintain normalcy. Helena seemed to want to talk, to explain, but couldn't find the time. Marcos sank into a silent routine, working more than necessary, avoiding being home. He didn't know what hurt more, the fact that she had done that or the coldness with which she now faced everything, as if the guilt were merely a consequence of a minor mistake. The breaking point came on a specific night. It was Helena's company anniversary, a formal event, the kind where all employees attend with their peers, where speeches are made, milestones celebrated, and toasts exchanged. Helena mentioned the event days before but didn't invite him. She simply said it would be tiring, that he would be bored, and that not all spouses would be present. Marcos, on an impulse he didn't understand at the time, decided to show up. Perhaps he was seeking answers she wasn't offering, perhaps he simply wanted to see for himself the life she lived without him. He dressed discreetly, arrived without fanfare, and entered the room. The atmosphere was sophisticated, with ambient music, dimmed lights, and champagne glasses held by smiling executives. He walked among the people, looking for her, unsure of what he expected to find. And then he saw. Helena was in the background, laughing with a man he'd never seen before. The laughter was loose, intimate. The way she touched his arm during their conversation left no doubt. The gesture that followed was quick, but enough. A kiss. Not a distracted peck, but a kiss that carried comfort and familiarity. Marcos froze. There was no drama. There was no scandal. Just a deafening silence that blanketed everything around him. It was as if the world had paused, as if he were watching from outside his own life. His chest ached, but it was a strange kind of pain, not sharp, but deep, as if something inside him had been ripped out with bare hands. He didn't stay to see more. He didn't go to her. He simply left the place like someone abandoning a battlefield where they already know they've lost. He walked the streets like a specter, aimless, without a clear thought. You didn't cry that night. You didn't scream either. The pain was so raw that not even tears dared to appear. It was an emptiness difficult to describe, a sense of loss that concerned not just love, but identity, history, the trust so devotedly placed. That night was the end of something that had been crumbling for a long time, but which until then he had refused to acknowledge. The next day, Helena showed up at home as if nothing had happened. When she saw Marcos, she froze. He was calm, eerily calm. She tried to explain, saying she hadn't expected him to come, that she hadn't wanted him to see it that way. He heard her but didn't respond. The pain had become an insurmountable silence, a barrier that not even the strongest love could cross. In the days that followed, he left the house for a while. He said he needed to breathe, think, figure out what to do with it all. And she finally began to understand what she had lost. Not just her husband, but the trust, the admiration, the gaze of someone who saw her whole. Marcos spent weeks trying to understand what hurt more, the betrayal itself or the way it all happened. It was as if the ground had suddenly shattered and he was trying to balance on the shards. He thought about the postponed conversations, the ignored signals, the disguised absences. Everything made sense now, like puzzle pieces that only fit together after the image has already been destroyed. He didn't know if he could forgive, but he also didn't want to live with anger. The love still existed somewhere, but it was too wounded to stand. Helena tried to get back together. She sent messages, asked for dates, wrote letters. She said she regretted it, that it was all a mistake, that she didn't know what she was doing. But Marcos wasn't the same man anymore. Something in him had changed. The pain had left deep scars, but it had also awakened something he hadn't known, the ability to preserve himself. And as she began to face the consequences of her own choices, Marcos slowly began to rebuild his life. It was still too early to understand everything that would come next, but there was something he didn't know, something Helena was hiding, a detail that would change everything he thought he understood about that betrayal. But that was yet to come. Time had run its course, but with it came no relief, only the increasingly solid weight of what had been broken. Marcos didn't seek answers or confrontation, simply walked away like someone who understands there's nothing left to say when the truth has already been revealed in silence. Helena, on the other hand, began to live between attempts at reconciliation and the stifled despair of someone beginning to understand, too late, the true value of what they've lost. She sought him out through messages, missed calls, letters left under the door. And yet, he remained quiet, centered, a man rebuilding, not out of pride or revenge, but out of vital necessity. It was no longer a question of whether or not to return, but of remaining whole. After a few weeks, Helena managed to convince him to meet her. It was a gray, stuffy Sunday, when the weight of unsaid things seemed to suffocate the atmosphere. They sat across from each other in a small cafe, the kind of place they had never frequented together. She was restless, her hands trembling, her gaze lost between guilt and regret. Marcos was firm, with an expression that mixed tiredness and peace, as if she had cried all there was to cry. She began with rehearsed words, saying that time had been cruel to her, that he had no idea how much it was destroying her, that she just wanted a chance to explain. Marcos said nothing for a few moments, just stared into the bottom of his cup, as if trying to summon some last bit of patience to hear her out. That was when Helena, as if she could no longer bear the weight of her own mistake, blurted out something that had seemed to have been bottled up for a long time. She said she didn't want to justify anything, but that he needed to know everything. She said she didn't expect him to forgive her, but that she needed him to understand what had really happened, and why. She leaned forward, her eyes welling, and said it hadn't just been about desire, or need, or that fleeting, rootless romance. That it all started long before, at a point he would never have suspected. And it was in that moment, her voice almost breaking, that she confessed what she'd been hiding all along. The man she'd cheated on him with, the one he'd seen kissing her at the party, wasn't just a coworker, nor a recent acquaintance, nor a casual mistake. He was someone she'd known for a long time. An old flame, someone she'd had a relationship with even before she met Marcos. And more than that, a man for whom she still carried unresolved feelings when she married him. It took Marcos a few seconds to react. The silence that fell between them was unlike the previous ones. This one was denser, almost palpable. He looked up, trying to decipher what this revelation meant, and Helena, realizing there was no going back, continued. She said that, in the early years of their marriage, she truly believed she had moved on. That Marcos had filled all the spaces left by that past. But that, some time later, when their paths crossed again by chance, something inside her reopened. She said she fought against it, that she felt confused, that she tried to suppress it, but failed. And that when she realized it, she was too involved to stop. She said that the other man, contrary to appearances, was not a stranger who seduced her on occasion, but someone she had never completely forgotten, and that shamed her. Marcos listened to everything without interrupting, but inside, each word seemed to tear what little remained to pieces. It wasn't just the physical betrayal, it was the emotional betrayal, silent, prolonged. The certainty that, all this time, he had been competing for space with a shadow from the past that had never truly been exorcised. He asked, his voice low and firm, if she had ever truly chosen him. Helena cried. She said yes, that she had loved him, that she still loved him, but that she had done everything wrong. That she didn't know how to deal with her own feelings, that she had confused longing with unfinished love, and that now she understood that she had ruined everything not because of a lack of love for Marcos, but because she hadn't had the courage to face what she still carried within her. Marcos got up from the table. For a moment, it seemed like he was going to leave. But he sat back down, crossed his arms on the table, and said that what destroyed him most wasn't the kiss, nor the fact that she'd been involved with someone else, but the lie he'd sustained for so long. He said he could have dealt with the pain of an impulsive choice, with a momentary mistake, but not with living daily alongside someone who smiled at him while his heart was tied to someone else. He said he could no longer trust, not out of revenge or pride, but because trust requires a ground that no longer exists between them. She tried to touch him, but he stepped back, gently, as if understanding that a gesture isn't enough to bridge a chasm. She told him the other man had broken up with her weeks after the party. She said she'd never intended to get back together. She'd been curious, felt a kind of nostalgia, but had already moved on a long time ago. That, in truth, she was the one who believed she could revive something dead, and now, alone, she realized the folly of her choice. She said she'd lost both, the past she'd idealized and the present she'd destroyed. Marcos looked at her with suppressed pain. It wasn't anger. It was grief. A disembodied, unceremonious, but real grief. He then said, with a tone that mixed melancholy and relief, that he had met someone. It wasn't permanent, nor passionate, but someone who made him laugh, who knew how to listen, who arrived lightly, without carrying ghosts. Helena stared at him, silent, and a tear slowly fell. For the first time, she seemed to understand that she had truly lost him. Not just the man by her side, but the place she held in his heart. He said he felt no pleasure in saying that. That, if he could, he would have preferred none of this to happen. But now it was too late. That love can survive many things, but it doesn't survive when it becomes merely a unilateral choice. She still tried to argue, saying she understood the hurt, but that she needed a chance to rebuild. That everything she'd experienced with the other man had painfully shown her how rare Marcos's love was. He calmly responded that forgiveness wasn't the same as starting over. That forgiveness, yes, he could. And maybe one day he would. But going back, that was impossible. Because now he knew that, while he gave his best every day, there was a part of her that had never been his. And that no one could give back. The cafe, which had begun as a meeting place, became the final stage for a love that endured everything except the absence of truth. Marcos stood, left the money on the table, and before leaving, looked at Helena one last time. He said he hoped she would be well. That she would find peace. But that he was no longer part of this quest. And he left. There was no anger in his walk. There was a kind of liberation, a bitter but necessary relief. Helena remained there for hours, reliving every word, every gesture. And it was on that day that she understood, with a pain only those who regret it feel, that she wasn't betrayed by the past, she was destroyed by not knowing how to value it when she had the chance. What she didn't yet know was that the wound she left in Marcos would not only transform him, but would lead him to experience something she could never offer. And when she finally saw this, she would understand the true weight of her choices. Marcos didn't return home that night, nor the next. Something inside him no longer fit within the same four walls that had once held so much love but now echoed only with uncomfortable memories. He needed space, air, new sounds other than the heavy breathing of a broken marriage. He spent a few days staying in a simple hotel, where the silence was different, where the walls didn't remind him of what had been said or what had been left out. For the first time in a long time, he felt free to feel everything he needed to without mincing words, without pretending to be normal. There was no one watching, waiting for answers, begging for forgiveness. Just him and the emptiness. But strangely, that emptiness didn't hurt as before. It was an emptiness that made room for something new, even if he didn't know what that was. Meanwhile, Helena paced the house like a stranger. Every corner was a cruel reminder of what she had destroyed. She couldn't listen to music, couldn't watch anything, couldn't sleep in the room that had once been theirs. She tried to keep busy with work, but her concentration slipped through her fingers like sand. Her colleagues noticed her instability, but no one dared ask. Her fake smile no longer convinced anyone, not even herself. And on the longest nights, she lay on the couch with her phone in her hand, staring at Marcos's name, not daring to type anything. She knew he wouldn't respond. And even if he did, she knew nothing she said would have the power to erase what had been revealed. A week later, Marcos decided to return to the house, not out of hope, but to gather what was his. Helena wasn't there. He entered silently, crossing the hallway like a visitor. Every object, every photograph, every trace of that life he'd built with such care now seemed out of place, devoid of meaning. He gathered up his clothes, documents, and books, and avoided looking at the side of the bed where she slept. When he left the keys on the living room table. He didn't write a note, didn't leave a message. The decision had already been made, and didn't need words to be understood. It was only a month later, now in a different apartment, in a distant neighborhood, that Marcos again experienced something resembling peace. It wasn't lightness yet, but it was a beginning. He began walking in the mornings, changed some habits, made small renovations in his new home, and rediscovered simple pleasures. And it was in this context of quiet rebirth that he met Livia, in one of the cafes he frequented on weekends. She was different from Helena in every way, in the way she spoke, in the silences she respected, in the lightness with which she smiled. But what struck him most was her lack of haste. Livia didn't intrude. She simply appeared, slowly, with a kind of presence that didn't demand space. They began talking about books, then music, until, naturally, their encounters became frequent. Livia didn't ask invasive questions, but she listened attentively. Marcos gradually found himself telling parts of his story, not as a vent, but as someone who had already understood that scars are part of who we are. She never interrupted him, never tried to correct or minimize his pain. She simply listened. And there was something deeply healing in that listening. There was no rush to begin anything. The first touches were timid, and the first kiss came only when the silence between them was comfortable. It was a love that blossomed with the care of someone who had already learned the importance of delicacy. Helena learned about Livia by chance, through a coworker who saw them together in a bookstore. There was no scandal. Just a deep sense of definitive loss. She didn't expect him to return, but she didn't expect him to be so peaceful. She was overcome by a contradictory feeling. She wanted him to be well, but she didn't want him to be so well without her. And that's when the penny dropped. She understood that it was no longer about the mistake she had made, but about the irreversible consequences of that mistake. And worst of all, she still loved him. But now, loving him was no longer enough. Months passed, and Marcos and Livia's life continued. It was a pressure-free relationship, built on maturity and genuine affection. Marcos allowed himself to laugh sincerely, to make plans without fear, to dream again. And even when memories of Helena surfaced, they no longer hurt as before. They were just scars, no longer open wounds. One of those Sundays, he received an unexpected message. It was from Helena. Short, direct. It said she needed to talk, in person, just once, without asking for anything, just to deliver something that was important to her. Marcos hesitated. Livia noticed his unease and asked if he wanted to talk about it. He told her. He held nothing back. And she, with a serene look, simply replied that she wasn't afraid of his past, she was only afraid that he would get hurt again. Marcos thanked her, and the next day, he decided to meet Helena. Out of respect. For closure. The meeting took place in a quiet park, under the shade of an ancient tree. Helena was different. Not in her face, nor in her clothes, but in her gaze. There was something tired there, something broken. She didn't try to hug him. She simply nodded and sat across from him. For a while, he said nothing. Then, his voice breaking, he began to speak. She said that since he left, she had tried to find meaning in everything she had done. That she had lost herself in regrets, in failed attempts to understand what had led her to sabotage the only love that truly sustained her. He said he had understood that much of what she had done was out of fear. Fear of feeling invisible, fear of no longer being wanted, fear of growing old and becoming irrelevant. Marcos listened silently, respecting her outburst but maintaining an inner distance. And then Helena pulled an envelope from her bag. She said it wasn't a goodbye letter, nor a request for him back. It was just something she needed to deliver. He opened it. Inside was a photo. It was old, from long before they met. In it, Helena and the man she cheated on him with, embracing in front of a university. On the back, a handwritten sentence: "What I thought I'd lost back then, never really existed." She explained that, in the days following the betrayal, she tried to find the man again, not to rekindle the romance, but to understand her feelings. She wanted to apologize, perhaps close the cycle. And when she found him, he was direct. He said he never loved her the way she thought he loved her. That he liked her, yes, but that she had always been a support system, not a true love. That when they met again, he felt curiosity, but not longing. That he used her as a distraction. And that he would never have chosen her. That broke something inside Helena. Because it wasn't just the end of a romance. It was the end of an illusion she'd held onto for years. She discovered, brutally, that she'd traded real love for a fantasy built on memories that had never been sincere. She told Marcos she wasn't telling him this to make him feel sorry, nor to get something back. She was telling him because she needed him to know that, now, she understood. That everything she sought outside, she already had inside. And that she lost it. Alone. With her own hands. Marcos put the photo away. He stared at it for a moment. Then he said, his voice calm, "I also had to lose everything to understand what truly mattered. But the difference is that I chose to preserve. You chose to risk. And now, we live with what's left." Helena nodded. No tears. Just pain. He said goodbye, got up, and left. This time, without regret. And as he walked out of the park, the wind blew gently, as if washing away the last remnants of the past that still clung to his skin. That same day, when he arrived home, he found Livia sitting on the porch, reading. She looked at him and smiled. And there, in that simple gesture, Marcos knew he was exactly where he belonged. Because now, more than ever, he knew the value of loyalty. And he would never again accept anything less. As he left the park that afternoon, Marcos no longer carried the weight of unanswered questions or the anguish of doubt that had gnawed at his days for the past few months. What Helena had given him, in words, in gestures, in the open pain in her eyes, was not just the closing of a cycle, but the confirmation that he had done the right thing. And not because he was perfect or free from flaws, but because he had chosen the harder path, that of integrity. He carried the photo with him, folded and tucked away in a yellowed envelope, as a silent reminder that love is not always enough, that even the most sincere love can die when betrayed by those who should protect it. But there was no longer any anger. What remained now was a melancholic maturity, a painful lucidity that allowed him to see things clearly. Marcos found himself at an emotional crossroads, no longer about whether to return or move on, but about what to do with the pain that no longer belonged to him, but that still pulsed in his memories. The following days were marked by an inner stillness difficult to name. The weight of Helena's absence was gone, because she was no longer part of the present. But there was also no full sense of freedom. It was as if he still needed to traverse a corridor of ancient echoes before finally reaching the pure silence of a new beginning. Livia noticed this. Not with pressure, but with a sensitivity that made her even more admirable. She didn't pressure, didn't ask where his thoughts were, but was always there, available, present without suffocating. And this constant, light, and honest presence began to transform into something profound. It wasn't an overwhelming passion, the kind that consumes quickly and disappears just as quickly. It was something rarer, a solid construction, built on mutual admiration, companionship, and absolute respect for each other's wounds. They began to share more than just coffee and conversation. They began planning short trips, sharing responsibilities, and making room for a daily life together. But the most surprising thing for Marcos wasn't the fact that he was in love again, it was how much it didn't make him forget what he'd experienced, but rather understand. With Livia, he learned that he didn't need to erase the past to start over, but that he could look back with dignity, knowing he hadn't betrayed his own principles. And this was the dilemma that was beginning to mature within him, how to keep his heart open to love without allowing hurt to shape his decisions. He knew there was still a part of him that hurt, and that this pain could one day contaminate him if it wasn't embraced. Livia, sensitive to this, encouraged him to talk. Sometimes, with just a look, she made him feel safe to be vulnerable again. It was on one of those nights, when the sky was clear and the air was light, that Marcos spoke about the difficulty of trusting completely again. He said that, although he knew Livia wasn't Helena, the fear of not being enough returned in unexpected waves. She listened to him attentively and replied without hesitation that true love isn't one that ignores the other's traumas, but one that commits to walking alongside them, patiently. Marcos understood that, for the first time, he was with someone who wanted not only the beautiful parts of him, but also the fragile, the aching, the still healing. And in this understanding, something inside him began to blossom more freely. There was no longer a need to prove anything, just to live. Meanwhile, Helena tried to rebuild her life, but everything seemed too gray. Her attempts to return to her previous routine were met with memories that now seemed unbearable. The places, the smells, the rituals that had once been natural now confronted her with the image of what she had destroyed. She sought therapy, tried to fill the voids with commitments, but no distraction was enough. The silence of the house, now hers alone, was deafening. She still thought about Marcos every day. Not out of obsession, but out of genuine regret. It was difficult to accept that he had moved on, and even more painful to admit that she would never find someone who saw her with the clear eyes with which he had. One cold morning, Helena visited her parents. It was something she hadn't done in months. She needed a place where she could feel, at least for a few hours, like a daughter, and not a woman destroyed by her own choices. Her mother, noticing her haggard expression, didn't ask direct questions, but prepared the breakfast she'd spent childhood with, carefully set the table, and offered a silent embrace. It was there, amid the smell of fresh bread and the sound of the kettle, that Helena burst into tears. He didn't ask for advice, he simply poured it out. He said he'd done everything wrong, that he'd betrayed the most upright man he'd ever known, that he tried to revive an old feeling only to realize it had never been real. He said he now understood, with cruel clarity, that stability is not the opposite of passion, but its most valuable consequence. His mother listened with teary eyes, squeezed her hand, and said in a low voice that some lessons come late, but are still worth learning. Marcos, for his part, was increasingly present in his own life. He began writing about his feelings, something he had never done before. Not as a diary, but as a way of listening to himself. He wrote about what he had learned from love, about how betrayal not only destroyed his trust in the other person, but also nearly erased the trust he had in himself. He also wrote about forgiveness, not as a grand act, but as an ongoing choice. Forgiving, for him, was no longer about forgetting, but about not allowing the past to define his next steps. Livia read some of these texts and was moved. She said he didn't realize how much his words could touch others. She suggested he publish them, even if anonymously. He hesitated, but after a few weeks, he created a blog. And to his surprise, the texts began receiving comments from people who identified with him, who had also been betrayed, or who had been betrayed and were trying to rebuild their lives. This helped him more than he imagined. He felt that his pain was turning into something useful, something that helped others find their way through the darkness. But helping others wasn't enough. He still needed to make an internal decision. Something he'd been putting off. He needed to decide if he was ready to build something deeper with Livia, or if he still needed more time for himself. It was an emotional crossroads, not about her, but about him. Because he knew she deserved a whole love, not halves. He spent days reflecting, writing, walking alone. Until one night, he prepared a dinner for the two of them. Nothing fancy, just intimate. He put on soft music and lit candles. When Livia arrived, surprised, she asked if they were celebrating something. He smiled and said yes, they were celebrating the moment he finally chose to stay. Livia was moved. Not because she expected it, but because she knew that choice came from a sincere place. It wasn't an impulse, it wasn't an escape, it wasn't a response to the past. It was a conscious step forward. And there, between simple dishes and genuine glances, they committed to building something new, without ghosts. Helena, for her part, began to forge a different path. Alone, without shortcuts. She began studying again, sought new projects, did volunteer work. She understood that she could no longer be who she was before, but she could become someone better. And even if the past couldn't be erased, it could be redefined. She no longer sought Marcos, no longer tried to reclaim what was lost. Now, her journey was different, learning to live with what was left, with dignity, with regret, but also with a seed of maturity planted in the soil of pain. Time passed, not as a magical cure, but as a testament to the fact that love, when true, doesn't disappear, it transforms. And in Marcos's case, it transformed into strength, into wisdom, into a new kind of love that no longer depended on the other to exist. And by understanding this, he finally freed himself from the burden of being betrayed. Because now, finally, he knew he had won, not when he left Helena behind, but when he learned that being loyal to oneself is the greatest act of love one can offer the world. And it was with this understanding that he prepared himself for the new life that awaited him. The weeks following dinner were silent in a new way, not like the silence of an end, but the silence of something being cultivated. Marcos and Livia didn't speak of grandiose plans, they didn't declare their love aloud every day, but there was a mature complicity there that didn't need to be constantly asserted. It was a slow and sincere construction, made of understanding glances, small choices, and genuine presence. They no longer tried to prove anything to each other. There was no need. They both knew they had found themselves at a difficult point in their lives, and instead of healing alone, they decided to embrace each other in the process. There was no rush to resolve everything, just the certainty that they were walking side by side. And for Marcos, this was the kind of love that finally made sense. A love that sought not external shine, but inner peace. Still, there were days when the past visited him. Not as a ghost, but as a living reminder of everything he'd learned. Certain songs, certain phrases, places, scents. Helena continued to exist in his memory, but now as part of a completed story, not an unfinished chapter. When he thought of her, it wasn't with regret. It was with a kind of resigned longing, like someone remembering a book they'd read intensely but had already returned to the shelf. A chapter that was fundamental, but no longer has a place in the current narrative. And with this clear conscience, he rediscovered pleasures that once seemed small, walking beside Livia on Sunday mornings, making a leisurely coffee, reading a book without being interrupted by internal pain, listening to music and smiling instead of drowning in memories. It was in this context that, one day, he received an unexpected call from a number he didn't recognize. He answered on impulse, and on the other end, a male voice introduced himself as Eduardo, Helena's brother. Marcos hadn't seen him since before the separation, and the call took him by surprise. The tone was respectful but firm. Eduardo said he was calling because, despite everything in the past, he felt he needed to tell her something. He said Helena was going through an intense process of change, that she was truly different, and that she had confessed to her family how much she had wronged Marcos. Marcos listened silently, without interrupting. Edward wasn't trying to convince, just inform. In the end, he said Helena hadn't known about the call, and that she might be upset to find out. But that he, as her brother, felt the need to thank her, because despite everything, it was because of the loss of Marcos that Helena finally looked at herself honestly for the first time in years. After hanging up, Marcos stood there for a long time, the phone between his fingers, staring into space. There was no anger in that connection, no provocation, just a soft echo of recognition. And that, somehow, brought him peace. That same weekend, he and Livia traveled to a small coastal town. Nothing planned in advance, just a spontaneous decision made on a hot afternoon. They took the car, chose a simple inn, and spent 2 days away from it all. It was there, sitting on the sand, watching the calm sea and the sky in shades of orange and violet, that Livia asked a direct but calm question. She wanted to know if Helena sought him out again, he would feel like coming back. Marcos took a while to answer, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wanted to say it in the right words. He looked at the horizon and after a while said no. That story had been beautiful, intense, full of meaning, but that trust, once broken, couldn't be mended with nostalgia. That he truly wished Helena well, but that her place in his life was now different, no less important, but closed. Livia smiled slightly, rested her head on his shoulder, and simply said, "That's all I needed to know." That night, they slept in each other's arms, listening to the sound of the sea as the soundtrack to a new phase. Meanwhile, Helena continued her journey with dignity. She didn't seek out Marcos, didn't send messages, didn't make any more attempts at reconciliation. But silently, she followed from afar the few signs he left. She knew about his blog, read some texts, cried over others. She saw discreet photos of him with Livia, and even though her heart ached, she didn't feel envy. She felt a kind of bitter gratitude knowing he had found someone who saw him the way she couldn't. And it was through this awareness that she decided, for the first time, not to act impulsively. She didn't send messages, didn't show up unexpectedly, didn't try to make him jealous. She began to live for herself. She made new friends, went back to school, and got involved in social projects. She missed many things, but she learned not to turn that lack into despair. And that, for her, was a victory. One day, on one of those quiet spring mornings, Marcos received a notification, a new message left on the blog. It was from a woman who didn't sign her real name, but the content was painfully familiar. She spoke of regret, of how difficult it is to live with the echo of wrong choices, of how love, when wasted, becomes a ghost that walks beside you every day. Marcos read it calmly, more than once. He was sure it was Helena, even without a signature. But he didn't respond. Not out of coldness, but out of respect. For her. For Livia. And for himself. Silence was, now, the most mature way to honor the new life he had chosen. That night, while watching a movie together, Livia turned to him and said there was something special about his way of loving. That he wasn't intense in the sense of exploding emotions, but rather enduring. That his affection was like a sturdy house, sometimes discreet, but protective. Marcos, touched by her words, smiled and said he only learned this after seeing what happens when someone allows the foundation of that house to be eroded. He said that loyalty, for him, was what held everything together. That love, in the end, was a daily choice, made in the details, in the small decisions. And that he would choose her, always, as long as she chose him. And she replied that she had, since day one. And so it was that, amidst healed wounds, lessons learned, and respected silences, Marcos reconnected with his own essence. Not because he returned to square one, but because he understood that losses also build. And that sometimes, the pain of abandonment is what pushes someone to the place they were always meant to be. Livia, with her serenity, became part of his story not as a replacement, but as continuity. Someone who arrived at the right time, not to erase the past, but to illuminate the future. And Helena, even from a distance, continued her journey with greater awareness, knowing that, although she couldn't go back in time, she could at least transform what would come next. And this, however painful, was already a new beginning. Because in the end, every true love story, even when it ends, leaves us with the memory of what truly matters, and the responsibility to never betray ourselves again. It was a mild September morning when Marcos opened the window of the new apartment he now shared with Livia. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen, and the distant sound of children playing in the street drifted softly through the walls. He stretched leisurely, observing the peaceful rhythm of a life that no longer bore emotional urgency or open scars. The old pain hadn't disappeared, but now it was just a subtle mark, visible only to those who looked closely. Everything around him reflected balance, not the kind that comes from the absence of problems, but the kind that arises when one learns to deal with the consequences of one's choices and, above all, when one chooses truthfully. Livia entered the room with 2 coffees and a natural smile, the kind that doesn't ask for permission to exist. She handed him one of the cups and sat beside him, silently, simply enjoying his presence. There wasn't much need to be said. The bond between them was no longer made of promises, but of consistency. They had been through intense moments, hidden insecurities, heavy silences, but they were there, whole. Livia had made Marcos an even more complete man. Not because she healed him, but because she walked with him through the healing. She never wanted to fix him, just accompany him. And that was what made him love again with the confidence of someone who knows exactly what they want and, most importantly, what they no longer accept. That same day, hours later, while organizing papers in an old drawer, Marcos found the envelope containing the photograph Helena had given him in the park. For a moment, he stood there staring at it, trying to understand why he still kept it. It wasn't out of affection, nor was it out of resentment. It was simply out of respect for his own story. That photo represented more than a painful memory, it was proof that he had survived, that he had chosen the hardest path and still managed to move forward without carrying unnecessary weight. He picked up the photo, took a deep breath, and without hesitation, put it in a box, locked it, and tucked it away in the back of a closet. He no longer needed it within sight. The past was over. Meanwhile, Helena was preparing to embark on a new destiny. After much reflection, she had decided to accept an invitation to coordinate a social project in another state. It wasn't an escape, it was a fresh start. She needed to challenge herself, to get away from the same streets, the same faces, the same triggers that held her back. She was more mature, less impulsive, more introspective. There was no new love in her life, and for the first time, this didn't cause her distress. She was learning to live with herself, to respect her limits, to rebuild her self-esteem without needing anyone's validation. That woman who had once felt inadequate within a healthy relationship now looked at you honestly. She knew she had lost a rare man, but she understood that continuing to punish herself wouldn't bring him back. What she could do was not repeat the same mistakes with anyone else, and with that, perhaps, begin to regain some sense of dignity in the face of her own story. The night before the trip, Helena went to her apartment balcony, looked out over the city she loved so much, and wept silently. Not for the things that would never return, but for the time she wasted trying to seek outside what she already had inside. She considered writing a final letter to Marcos, but decided against it. He already knew. So did she. Their lives had moved on, and even though a piece of her soul still vibrated at the memory of his voice, she knew that this love now belonged to another woman, and that this wasn't an injustice, it was a consequence. Marcos, for his part, was beginning to reap the fruits of a new era. His blog posts had grown, receiving attention from readers who were deeply touched by his words. People from different backgrounds and realities shared experiences in the comments, some painful, others hopeful. And among these stories, he discovered a silent community of people trying to rebuild themselves after disappointments, deceptions, and betrayals. He understood that his words were not just about himself, but about all those who had ever loved truly and been broken by another's carelessness. He felt he had transformed the pain into something useful, and that was profoundly liberating. One night, returning from a lecture he'd been invited to give on relationships and emotional reconstruction, Marcos walked slowly down a dimly lit street, his head full of thoughts. When he arrived home, he found Livia asleep on the sofa, a book open on her lap. He sat beside her, stroked her hair, and watched her for a while. This was what he'd sought all his life: serenity, reciprocity, affection that didn't need to be begged for. He woke her with a light kiss and told her he was grateful for everything. She, half asleep, smiled and replied that she was too. And without realizing it, in that moment, they sealed something much greater than a promise. They sealed a love based on real presence, not idealized ideas. Helena left 2 days later. She arrived at her new destination with a light suitcase, without many plans, but eager to start over. Working with socially vulnerable families made her look even deeper into herself. She realized that her pain, though legitimate, was insignificant compared to the suffering of so many. This didn't nullify her, but rather made her grow. For the first time, she felt useful in a way that didn't depend on praise or acceptance. Her greatest reward now was seeing the smiles of those who were heard, welcomed, and respected. In many faces marked by pain, she saw reflections of her own guilt. And it was in this inverted mirror that she began to forgive herself, not because she deserved it, but because she needed to stay alive. Years later, in an unexpected reunion arranged by mutual friends, Marcos and Helena crossed paths again. There was no awkwardness, no sadness. Just a polite greeting, a restrained smile, a silent acknowledgement of everything they'd experienced. They chatted for a few minutes, discussing work, changes, and routines. When they said goodbye, there was a longer look, not filled with pain, but with mutual respect. Helena left with the certainty that this was the last time she would see him. And this certainty, strangely, freed her. She no longer needed to wait for anything. Marcos returned home that night to find Livia finishing organizing boxes of books. They would soon be moving to a larger house in a quieter area, where they planned to start a family. They sat on the living room floor among the boxes, drank wine from plastic cups, and laughed at the mess. When she asked how their reunion had been, he simply said, "It was necessary. And now, it's complete." She understood without him needing to explain. And in that silence, once again, they connected in a way words never could. This is the story of a man who was betrayed but chose not to betray himself. Of a woman who lost everything by not appreciating what she had, but found a new version of herself by facing her own choices. And of another woman who knew how to love with respect, presence, and patience, transforming what was pain into secure affection. Because in the end, life always exacts its toll, not with revenge, but with the exactness of its consequences. Comment below with your thoughts on this story. Would you have forgiven him? Do you think Marcos made the right choice? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. Remember, betrayal doesn't just destroy a relationship. It erodes respect, breaks trust, and undoes the foundation of everything built on love. Losing the loyalty of someone who loved you is too high a price to pay for a fleeting desire. And often, by the time the penny drops, it's too late to go back. This channel does not support any type of betrayal here. We show that every choice has weight. And some cost too much.